Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Measuring Student Learning in Any Setting. I'm Dina Meyer, Executive Marketing Manager at Corwin, the sponsor for today's presenters and content. Before I introduce your presenters, I want to review some technical aspects for today's presentation. If you experience any audio trouble, please check the audio settings on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings. And if you still have issues, please see the detailed audio troubleshooting file available in the resource list under the Q&A window. There are also other icons that open additional feature panels in the webinar console. You can read about today's speakers in the speaker bio window, click the resource list to download a copy of today's slides, and if you happen to join early, please refresh your browser to gain access to that file. And you can also follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag EWWebinar. To submit questions for our speakers, please type your question into the Q&A box. The presenters will do their best to answer your questions during the presentation and at the end as time permits. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible at edweek.org. We know it's tough settling in after a long holiday weekend, but we're confident this topic and today's presenters will keep you highly engaged as we respect and value your time. I now have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers, Dr. Douglas Fisher, Dr. Nancy Frey, Vince Bustamante, and Dr. John Hattie. Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey are both professors of educational leadership at San Diego State University and leaders at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Doug has served as a teacher, language development specialist, and administrator in public schools and nonprofit organizations. Nancy has been a special education teacher, reading specialist, and administrator in public schools. Doug and Nancy have engaged in professional learning communities for several decades, building teams that design and implement systems to impact teaching and learning. They have published numerous books, including Engagement by Design, the Teacher Clarity Playbook, and the PLC Plus book series. Vince Bustamante is an instructional coach, curriculum content developer, and author who currently works for Edmonton Catholic Schools as a social studies curriculum consultant. Holding a master's in education from the University of Victoria in Canada in curriculum and instruction, he serves to incorporate research into classroom practice. He's also recently published Great Teaching by Design from Intention to Implementation in a Visible Learning Classroom. And finally, John Hattie is an award-winning education researcher and best-selling author with nearly 30 years of experience examining what works best in student learning and achievement. His research, better known as visible learning, is a culmination of nearly 30 years synthesizing more than 1,500 meta-analysis comprising more than 90,000 studies involving over 300 million students around the world. His notable publications include Visible Learning for Teachers, and 10 Mind Frames for Visible Learning. Over the past several months, our presenters have been working with educators to make the biggest impact while teaching from a distance. And a question they've continually been asked is, how do we assess what our students have learned while teaching at a distance? To answer that question, your four presenters joined to create the assessment playbook for distance and blended learning, measuring student learning in any setting. Much of what will be presented today is drawn from this playbook. And Corwin is offering a 30% discount if you use the code PLAYBK30 at corwin.com. And now, to get answers to that question, I'll turn it over to your presenters and Vince to get us started.
Thank you so much, Dina. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I hope you glean quite a bit of information, and I'd just like you to look at the screen and see if that looks familiar to you. Teaching and learning in 2020 looks unbelievably different than it did even 1 year ago. We still have our students in front of us, although we have a screen and internet connection dividing us, and it seems like everything that has happened over the course of this past calendar year has been unbelievably tasked on teachers to pivot. And one of the tried and true institutions as schooling is, we have to remember that teaching and assessing is still important regardless of whether we find ourselves face-to-face in a blended learning environment or whether we are in a hybridization of both of those learning environments. So we were tasked with trying to determine what types of assessment would work best in our distance and blended learning environments, because it is very important. It's still important for us to determine what students know. And one of the aspects of what we were finding is that old formats were not really working from a distance. And in some cases, it felt a little bit like we were taking a square peg and trying to ram it into a round hole, in the sense that our students are learning differently, but we are still trying to assess them the same way that they were when they were learning face-to-face. And so we engaged on a journey to determine what works best in the distance and blended learning environment, and to take what we've used in the past and put a spin on it to ensure that we have appropriate assessment strategies for our students. Which brings us to our first section on assessment cookies.
And where we want to start here is with knowing the learner and their learning journey. It certainly is the case that regardless of the medium, if the students don't feel there is a positive relationship, not just between you, the teacher, and the students, but between fellow students, then their learning is not as successful. Now, that relationship is for a reason. It's not just for good in itself, but it's also because when you have that positive relationship, it's okay for the students to say, I don't know, I need help, I am confused. No student should come to the class thinking that they're there to learn that which they already know. It's what they don't know. So making that legitimate is really critical. And certainly students have very strong views about the credibility of the teacher. If they feel they're not liked by the teacher, then your work becomes almost incredibly impossible. But if they also feel that you have credibility, which means that they sense that they are going to learn something from you today, they are going to have an understanding, and it's okay to talk to you and fellow students, and they're more likely to do that and talk about what they don't know using the social media than they often are talking to you face-to-face. So we need to exploit that. So relationships is just as critical on social media as it is in the regular classroom. But probably what's most important about knowing the learner and their learning journey is knowing what their expectations are for the lesson. Do they have a sense that they are going to achieve in this lesson? They are going to delve deeply in appropriate spots. They are going to be turned on and motivated from this. And they pick that up very much from you. If they feel that you have high expectations for all the students, not just specific students, but for all the students, if they feel that you want to indulge them in their passion, and particularly when they sense that you can see something in them that maybe they can't see in themselves, then that's when we need to start the learning journey. So it's knowing the journey, it's doing great diagnosis, great discovery of what they bring to every class. Now think about those high expectations you have. The art is then making sure that they know what those criteria of success are in your mind. They know that you know what they bring to the class in terms of their prior achievements, that they then have these expectations. And it's expectations not just about the surface knowledge, that is the content, the subject vocabulary, the facts, but also about the deeper conceptual understanding and transfer. And so when students know near the start of a series of lessons, when's good enough? That is a major factor in terms of then interpreting the feedback they get, understanding the lesson, because they know what the goal of that lesson is, maybe over a particular lesson, or maybe over a few lessons, or over a few weeks. It should not be a guessing game. And certainly over the social media, it's even more important that maybe we need more steps in those success criteria than we may do in the regular classroom. And making sure that when we set those success criteria for our students, that they're set using the Goldilocks principle of challenge. Not too hard, not too easy, and not too boring. And so getting those 2 assessment cookies about knowing the learner, and students deserve to know what they should be learning. Oh, this is me too, sorry. The third one is this notion of everything is searchable, so plan accordingly. It shouldn't be the case that when students are asked, for example, to sit an assignment or sit an exam, that it's a secret, that they have to guess what's inside the teacher's mind. And over the internet, we have an extra constraint often, and that they do have access to Google and Siri and all the resources on the web. And so this is a really interesting challenge for us. I think we can do a lot of learning for when we come back to the regular classroom, like setting assessments and assignments that are open book, that students learn not just to be able to search for the information, but also to make the evaluative judgments about whether the information is worthwhile. And this is where this notion of surface and deep and transfer is very critical. Yes, we want the students to have knowledge and facts, and yes, they can gain that sometimes a lot easier through the Googles and such like. But then, how do we set a part of our assessments and our assignments so that we do the deep and transfer learning, which is bringing the ideas together? This is something that Google is not very good at. This is something that we want to have students to be able to understand, how they bring ideas together, and then how do they transfer those ideas to new situations. Surely, that's one of the major outcomes of our schooling. And so we need to plan accordingly, realizing that the skill of searching is an important skill. The skill of evaluating what you search is even more important. And the skill of relating those ideas is what we want our assignments to be more about. So Doug, what can we do?
Yes, exactly. What can we do? So there we are faced with this experience of parents over helping, students searching the internet for everything, and losing our confidence about whether or not students have learned from us or not. Did the lesson have an impact? Did the experiences I designed actually result in learning for my students? And that's where we started to struggle. What can we do? So we've been following this group of teachers since March 20th. And the beginning was all about setting up routines and procedures. And then the back to school was all about relationships with new students and setting the norms of class. And all of a sudden, the conversation shifted. How do we know if our students are learning? And so we collected all kinds of examples from this group of teachers, and we clustered them into these big areas. And so we're going to spend some time on each of those. So there are universal response opportunities, as Nancy's going to talk about, these micro assessments. There's this really cool opportunity to have students teach content back, and we'll explore that. And if you know the visible learning work that's gone on for quite a while, that's kind of like the thing, is having students become their own teachers and having them teach others and learning how to teach back. We're seeing a huge need to focus on writing and writing assessment and developing students as writers. And when we get to that section, John will share a little bit more about the need around writing that's been identified. And then self and peer assessment, I think the future of assessment, I hope the future of assessment is to get students more invested in assessing their own performance so their teachers can then become validators or challengers. And then eventually at some point, we have to evaluate whether or not students learned from us. Did the experiences we planned actually result in learning? And so we move into thinking like evaluators.
And universal response opportunities, as Doug noted, are a great micro-assessment. It's a way of being able to find out where your students are in the moment during instruction. And as we noted, this is what helps to propel learning within the lesson itself. So first I'll do a little definitional work on that. Universal response opportunities are simply these simultaneous replies. And every member in the group is expected to reply rather than simply posing a question and expecting a few students to be able to answer that question. Most of us know as teachers, by the end of the first week of school, we know who those 6 kids are that are in our classes that are going to answer the vast majority of those questions. And what can happen very quickly is that the other students also can identify who those go-to reliable repliers are. And instead, they kind of sit back and let those students sort of take the lead on everything. With a universal response, as I said, all of the students are simultaneously replying. There are a couple of advantages to that in particular, and it includes that it really fosters this rehearsal and retrieval, that what's happening is that as you pose a question to students, for example, in a universal response, that they have to consider what it is that they know. They have to find it in their brains. They have to retrieve that information. And we know that lots of practice with rehearsal and retrieval helps to make that learning more permanent. Some other advantages as well. One is on the teacher end of it. With a universal response, when all of the students respond with a whiteboard or with a card, for example, that you as a teacher get a quick read on how it is that students are doing in real time. It gives you that opportunity to be able to respond, to find out where it is that you can speed up and where it is that you might need to slow down, reteach, or clarify misunderstanding that students have. It also gives you a chance to be able to provide feedback to all of the students in the class, not just those one or two students that replied to it. Those incorrect replies also prompt students to be able to consider what it is they know and what it is that they don't know. In other words, you're kind of creating this cognitive dissonance when they have that incorrect reply, and they go back and they think about, they reflect on what it is that they know, what it is that they don't know. And then perhaps one of the strongest benefits of it is that it reduces this follow the leader kind of phenomenon. You know, when you pose a question, you ask students to reply in the chat, one or two students reply, and then after all the other students have seen those answers, then they may add it as well. With the universal response, you're getting opportunities for students to be able to reply, for you to be able to do that whole class check of understanding, and as I noted earlier, to prompt that rehearsal and retrieval that we know is so important in early learning. Another consideration for that is how often they might occur. And a good rule of thumb to follow is that every 10 minutes that you're asking a universal response question of one kind or another, it not only raises the level of activity that students are doing in their learning as well, but it's giving you more frequent information about how it is that students are doing. As John had noted earlier, that this is your discovery opportunity, finding out where it is that students are. And in a distance learning environment, we need to be able to get that information perhaps even more frequently than we would in a face-to-face environment. I kind of think of this as my GPS and my turn-by-turn response system that's in that GPS. Whenever I set a destination, it also gives me information along the way about whether I'm going in the right direction or not. And those universal response opportunities allow me as a teacher to be able to figure out, to find out if I'm moving in the right direction. Now, one of our current favorites is a waterfall chat. It goes by a number of different names in lots of different places, but a waterfall chat is simply this. As a teacher, you pause, you pose a question that's going to be answered in the chat, and you signal to students that they'll be answering in the chat. But rather than having them simply write their answer and submit, you ask them, you notify them, this is a waterfall chat, type your answer into the chat, but don't hit send or don't hit submit until I signal. That provides some wait time for students to be able to compose their answer, and at the count of 3, 3, 2, 1, send, and then much like a waterfall, you see all of the answers coming through at the same time. As a teacher, save that chat, save those waterfall chats so that you can go back and look at the responses that students gave, who gave what responses, and whether they were correct or not. And Doug is going to talk about response cards.
Yes, response cards. And so response cards are another option. And as you saw, we have to change this up on a regular basis. So we have to keep inviting students in, inviting students in, inviting students in. How do we get students to participate? How do we know they're learning? How can we create micro-assessments, universal response opportunities? So we want to be careful, like, okay, we're not going to do just one thing. The category is called universal response. How can we build more universal response opportunities into our classes? So this video will, I'm going to show you a clip of the video. It's a much longer video. We're only going to watch just about the first 90 seconds, and you can watch young kids in a response card, distance learning using response cards.
The word is mat. Mat. What is the beginning, the middle, and the ending sounds in mat? Mat. Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Dariana. Thank you, Dominic. Mat. What do you hear? Mat. You can always stretch the word. Mat. Here we go. Mat. Good. Let's try another one.
Awesome. So you get
go ahead and erase it. Keep your boxes.
Is inviting students in.
All right.
To that learning.
Here's the next one.
And you can see in the chat, there's all kinds of other ways to invite students for a universal response. Rather than calling on one student at a time, how can you use the universal response to know what's happening with students?
One of the most simple tools to use for universal response, and when we look at response cards, are those pre-printed response cards. If you are learning with students who are English language learners, or you have younger students, oftentimes this can facilitate the movement in a synchronous learning lesson in that having these pre-printed response cards gives our students the opportunity to choose specifically what they need to access and then ask or indicate to you synchronously that they may need some assistance, or as you can see on this example here, we have different colors for multiple choice answers. We have true or false. And these are just a simple tool that you can use and send home with your students, or if you have pickup parties at your schools, you can include these in your toolkits for your students. If that is a little bit out of realm, out of scope for your students, a simpler and much, I love this, I don't know why this is so simple, but I love it so much, is that you could take old CD or DVD cases, and on one side of the CD or DVD case, you would put a green piece of construction paper, and on the other side of the CD or DVD case, you could put a red piece of construction paper. And then as you are teaching to your students who are in your tile mode, and you can see all 20 or 30 of them at the same time, you can indicate that you're going to ask a question and then prompt the students with time and say, in 3 seconds or on the count of 5, I want you to indicate on your CD case, red for I need a little bit more assistance or I don't understand, and green for I fully comprehend. And as you engage in the countdown, the students prepare, and then they show you their response card. And what you can do is 2 things. You can take a screenshot of your class, and then at a later date you can determine which students indicated that they need more assistance, and you could go and coach privately. And then you could just in real time, you could have a look and see, well, a majority of my students are holding up red, which means I, as a teacher, need to take a step back and maybe re-engage in instruction. One of the benefits of these response cards is not only does it gauge the students on what they know or do not know, it also informs your practice as a teacher in that you may need to stop and readjust your instructional practice before moving on. And these response cards are, you can just, I'm sure everyone has old CDs or DVDs in their house somewhere, probably in a storage unit right now, and it's just a quick upcycle for you. So those are two examples of response cards, and I'm just going to hand it over to John to talk about Teachback.
Look, this is a really exciting thing to do in any circumstance. Probably the best exit ticket from any class is to ask the students, can you now teach this to someone else? We know there's been a lot of research on peer tutoring. Too often, however, the implication is that the brighter students teach the not so brighter students, and some parents get a bit upset that they didn't send their children to school so they could be taught by other kids. And so this notion of Teachback is very, very powerful. And the argument is that we want you on various occasions to teach back the surface level knowledge, the deep level knowledge to other students or to the teacher. Now, one of the really key issues here is this is where you hear whether the students have understood or whether they haven't understood, what they understand, what's going on, and also you pick up the other attribute of the social sensitivity of are they then aware of the person listening to them teaching back about what that person is understanding and not understanding. And so then you can get into quite a lot of dialogue and discussion, which you do as teachers anyway. You do as teachers every day. But then teaching your students, deliberately teaching your students how to teach back. Now, we've known for many years that when students talk with peers, that's an incredible opportunity to consolidate what they've learned. So that's Teachback is also capitalizing on this notion. It's capitalizing on them having to work out in preparation for a Teachback session what they know, what they don't know. We all know that teachers need to have various surface and deep forms of subject matter knowledge as we go about teaching. Why isn't it for the same student? Why isn't it for the students as well? And so in the Teachback sessions, you can either use it to have a student teach back to another student, to a group of students, the whole class. They could teach back just to the teacher, or they could teach back to their family. I know in Doug and Nancy's school, they have Teach Back Tuesdays. And on a Tuesday, that's the occasion where the students consolidate what they've been doing for the week. And so we're recommending that this notion of Teach Back is extremely powerful. Associated with that is this notion of retell, which is probably more specific, explaining what it is that you remember. Asking also, we want you to retell in terms of what you know and what you don't know and understand. And this tells and helps tell the teacher in a very time-efficient way about where you may need to go next. So why don't we also see some videos, Doug, of Andrea in action here?
Yes. Let's watch a young man, student talking back, teaching back, retelling the content.
So this is going to be retelling of a story about racial rights. Hey, okay, so it starts with a kid in his room. His name is Mason Stone. Mason Steele. He's a smart, dark-colored boy. He was riding in his room when his father called for his name. He's like, Mason Steele, Mason. And then he asked his wife, where's that boy? Then he said, writing his books, dear. And then Mason comes down with a binder full of papers. And then
so you get a sense of this young man's retelling, though I'm talking over him. And now we're going to watch another student. This one is going to teach content back. In this case, to the class.
Write me a letter. And then after...
Hello, class. So we are going to compare numbers, and the numbers we are comparing are 436,425 and 450,123. So the bigger one would be this one because the alligator would want to eat it. The reason why the alligator would want to eat this number is because you easily see the 4 and then the 4. They're equal. But you would go to the next one and there's a 3. And then there's a 5. 5 and 3 are not equal. So you would go to the one that's bigger and you would put the alligator and then you would circle it. And if you ever have another problem like this and these are staying equal but the last one isn't, then you have found your answer of which one's bigger. So thank you so much.
Today,
Hello.
And the name of the game, when it comes to assessment, is finding out about what our impact has been on learning. So often we end up talking about teaching when really what it is that we should be focused on is what it is that students are learning. It has been our custom over the last several years to pose these particular questions to learners on a regular basis in order for us to be able to get feedback about the impact of our teaching. We want students to be able to answer the question, what am I learning today? And that especially comes through in terms of how it is that we utilize those learning intentions. Why am I learning this? That's the relevancy piece. And it's up to us as teachers to help build that relevancy in, to bake that relevancy into the instruction that we're doing. And then finally, we want students to be able to answer that third question, how will I know that I have learned it? Now, as I said in the past, it had been our habit to pose these questions to learners on a weekly basis in order to gauge what that learning was and whether they were able to respond to that. Now what we're finding is that obviously because we're in distance learning, we can't ask those questions directly to students in a face-to-face manner, that instead what teachers are doing is having students submit either through Google Forms to be able to answer those questions or to use a simple recording like, for example, Flipgrid in order to be able to pose those on a weekly basis. What have I learned about? Why am I learning this? How will I know that I've learned it? Here's one example of a student talking about what it was that she learned in her statistics class on a particular topic.
Today in stats class, we are talking about an interesting topic about the purpose of random assignments and the importance of it, which is to make each assignment or group equal and to eliminate biases. I learned it because I know that I can use it in the future, or I can maybe even use it now already, so that when it comes to getting to know or seeing a random experiment, I won't get fooled by it and know if everything's equal or correct, or if I'm ever going to make a random experiment myself, I can or I will know what to incorporate. I know I have learned this because I can explain to you what I'm learning in stats.
And so we come to self and peer assessment, which we've kind of mentioned in the previous slide. But this is the time where we want the students to take on more responsibility for determining and understanding what it is they know, what it is they don't know. We want them to build that sense of confidence, but we also want it to be very much based on an improvement mentality. It's not the notion that we're going to get peers, for example, to assess to grade. that requires specific skills and credibility that you have as a teacher, and maybe some students don't feel that their fellow peers have that same sense of credibility. And so the focus here is on what do we know and what do we need to know? Where do we go next? And it does require us to specifically teach the students the skills of assessment. Clearly, giving them a rubric on which they can make judgments about themselves and about their peers. The beauty of peer assessment is we also have to teach that sense of social sensitivity, understanding, in the same way that you know that when you make comments on your students' work, there is a recipient at the other end. There is a student at the other end that is going to interpret that, or maybe even dismiss what you write if you don't write it in a way that's got an improvement focus. When we ask students what their concept of feedback is, they're very much tuned to the notion of, does it help me know where to go next? And if it's just critique or just comments or just reactions, many will argue black and blue, despite many comments that you make, they do not receive feedback. And so one of the keys when we're doing self and peer assessment is not only to ask them about what's the current reaction, how can this piece of work be improved, but it's also that notion of, and where do you go next? What additional things could they go? Where's a great resource? And it's a bit like looking at the group chat in today's seminar. I've picked up many great ideas about how I can improve some of the techniques and tools and methods I'm using because of the improvement recommendations that you're making. And so it's moving also to helping the students in their peer and their self-assessment to look at error detection. And that's a really important skill, working out where it is you're making mistakes, where it is you haven't got sufficient information, where it is you're having some difficulties. Also the skill of teaching them to seek feedback, not just wait for it to come, but seek the feedback. And so there's really an incredible part that when we work and students work, not only self to you, self to their peers, but also doing peer assessment to more consolidate what their learning is. Vince.
And whether in a distance learning environment, your self and peer assessment is as simple as rating your breakout room conversation using hand gestures from 1 through 5, to engaging students into discussing what learning looks like. And so in this case, what you see, and it might be a little small on your screen, but in this case, the teacher challenged her students to determine what an A student, a B student, and a C student would look like in a Google Doc. And students participated in a conversation as well as in population of this Google document. And you'll see that there are some red highlights. And the reason that there are some red highlights is because what was happening in this case was that students were discussing issues of compliance. So an A student would be compliant like this, a B student would be compliant like that, a C student would be compliant like so, et cetera, et cetera. And what the teacher challenged the students to do is to change the tune of what the student looks like away from compliance into discussions about learning. And so it's very important that when we engage our students into self and peer assessment, that our students are clear on what they are assessing. We don't want our students to assess compliance, self-assess compliance. We want them to assess their learning. So in many cases, our challenge as distance learning teachers is to move our students away from passive participants of learning into active drivers of learning. And John mentioned the creation of rubrics or sharing of rubrics, and they can be as simple as a partner talk rubric like you see here, which has a little diagram and a little descriptor of what partner talk should look like, to a rubric that might be a little more elaborate like what you see here. And in this rubric, it has the learning intention on the left, and then the tasks in the middle, and then there are success criteria in that third column. But I would like to draw your attention to the last two columns. And if you can't see that too closely, what it says is a before rating and an after rating. And what we want our students to do is to self and peer assess on their learning. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to have our students make a prediction on their rating prior to learning on the success criteria. So I would rate myself as, let's just say we decided that it would be on a 5 scale, just like our assessment of our breakout room. I would assess myself at a level 2, and then at the end of the learning, I would reassess myself at a level 4. And that self-assessment can give my teacher the ability to validate my learning, right? We want to move our roles as assessment to teachers as the validators of students' self-assessment. So it can be done using this, and I know we will be discussing single-point rubrics, but I think it's really important as we engage in this evaluation of what our students know and do not know, to evaluate not just an achievement at one point in time, but to evaluate the process of their learning from before to after.
And as Vince said, single-point rubrics are just one additional way that we can help students self-assess. For an example, here's an example of a single-point rubric about learning and subtracting numbers. And the student's job is to say, where can I still grow? And where are my glows? What am I really, really good at? And if a student does this, and I was chatting with Kevin, as you might have seen earlier, if a student does this, you are no longer in the position of being the arbiter, the judge of whether or not students learn. You are in the position of saying, I agree with you here, I want to challenge you there. The students are self-assessing. Here's an example in writing. That in writing, students can also say, here's area I need work, and here's areas that I'm exceeding the expectations. And of course, we can have this happen. We can do this with our students. So this is a student's example of a self-assessment using a single-point rubric that says, here are areas I need to strengthen, and here are areas are my strength, and then you can see the bottom of the comment. And then here's what the teacher wrote. Now, how much faster is this for those of you out there who are talking to me about time in the chat? If you want to save some time, have the student self-assess. Look, check, I agree. Here's a couple comments. Because the students own their assessment data. It's their data. They should be assessing their own performance towards proficiency, mastery, competence. We should serve as guides to validate, challenge, and we should use that data to say what worked, what didn't work, what impact did I have. And I promise you, if you teach students to self-assess and you give them really good tools, you will save time in your assessments. I'm probably going to have to say this, but Nancy, you're on mute.
I got it. And that brings us to the topic of evaluation, because assessment includes how it is that we evaluate what it is that students have learned. There are lots of responsibilities that we all have in terms of being able to report grades, report toward mastery and all of that. And a major concern that lots of educators have is the likelihood of cheating. As John had noted at the beginning of our session today, pretty much everything is searchable, so you've got to plan accordingly for all of that. It requires that we look at a broader assessment map about how it is that we measure student learning. But let's get back to the concern that all of us have about cheating in particular. And there's been some really interesting research that's been done about dishonesty in student assessments. And by the way, this is not something that is unique to distance learning. Cheating has been happening for as long as there have been schools and as long as there have been tests. But some really interesting, more recent work has come out around the usefulness of honor codes and how it is that they actually impact whether a student will be dishonest or not. So the good news overall is that most students are not deeply dishonest. However, if there is a likelihood that they can get away with it, then the temptation, of course, is there. What these researchers did was looked at the prevalence of cheating, sharing answers, and plagiarism at a number of different institutions, and they compared those institutions that utilized honor codes and those institutions that did not. And they found in particular that there was a 50% reduction in the amount of those kinds of cheating things that happen in those institutions that had honor codes and that use the honor codes. And I think that's the really important piece. Most institutions can say, yes, we have honor codes, but how is it that they're being used? How is it in particular that they are being well implemented and that they're really strongly embedded into the student culture? They're not just words that are printed on paper, but having students really live by that and be reminded of that. They serve as a moral reminder for students. And what these researchers and other researchers have found in particular is that what's really useful is not only teaching about the honor code and teaching about ethics, which, by the way, we should always be doing anyway, but then also, too, including those at the beginning and at the end of the exam. I like what this teacher did in particular about asking, posing the question at the beginning about, do you understand what this is? And then at the end, did you do anything that might be considered to be shady? And I love the answers that students offer on there. They are actually very honest in many cases about that. But it's a clarion call for all of us in distance learning to remind ourselves once again of what it is that we know about teaching towards ethical responsibility and how it is that we should be and can be imbuing that into the daily practices that we have at school, not only trotting out that honor code right before it's time to do some kind of formal test of one kind or another.
And I really like that comment in there from that student that they're very proud of what they've done. And that kind of brings us to this major point that underlies a lot of what we're talking about today. When we talk about teachers, school leaders, we want them to think like an evaluator. We want them to evaluate their impact, what they mean by impact, how many students are gaining that impact, and what's the amount of growth that they're making about that impact. Well, it's the same with students. We want our students to think like an evaluator. We want them to have a better understanding of when they're right and when they're wrong, when they're doing well and when good's not good enough and when good is good enough. We want them to also go beyond just the content and the facts and go beyond being Mrs. Google to having deeper understanding and to having relating between ideas and transfer. We want them to think like an evaluator in terms of demonstrating by methods like teach back, like retell, like having the universal response. And we also want them to have understandings as an evaluator of the worthwhileness of what they do, like we just saw with that student being very proud. We want them to enjoy this process of learning. We want them to focus as evaluators of learning about what's going on in their current scenario, their current environment, their current learning, so they have a better understanding of where to next. In many ways, the definition of an educated person is they know what to do and they don't know what to do. And that's a key part of the evaluation. But most importantly, we want them to enjoy the thrill of learning. As we all know, that sense of enjoyment that comes from learning. And it comes from learning, it doesn't precede learning in the sense that our job is to not make interesting, engaging tasks for kids to do, but our job is to get them to learn things so that they can realize that there is an enjoyment in that learning. And most of all, when we think like an evaluator, sometimes we have to stop and smell the roses and enjoy not only what we have done as teachers, but also to get the students to realize that they also can smell the roses in terms of the success they're making in their learning journey. Dina.
Great. Well, I think I speak for the thousands of educators that are on this webinar today in offering a really big thank you to Doug, Nancy, Vince, and John for this, very timely presentation filled with incredible, valuable information. And I wanted to let everyone know that if you're interested in exploring assessment of learning from a distance in greater depth, that Corwin does offer assessment of learning institutes. You'll see them on the screen here in January and February. And for more information or to register for those institutes, just visit corwin.com/DLP assessment. Corwin.com/DLP assessment. Additionally, I wanted to remind you again of the 30% discount we're offering. Use code PLAYBK30 to get a 30% discount on any of the Distance Learning Playbook collection of books, including the Assessment Playbook, which again, a lot of the content that you heard today was based from that first book that you see. The original book that came out first was the Distance Learning Playbook for K-12. We've also added the Distance Learning Playbook for Parents, the Distance Learning Playbook for College and University Instruction, and the Distance Learning Playbook for School Leaders. Also remember, a recording of this webinar will be available at edweek.org within the next 24 hours. Looks like we have a few minutes left here. If any of the presenters wanted to go through and answer any unanswered questions that we see, or people can add more questions, I'll turn that back over to you.
Thank you. I said that John would hopefully talk a little bit about writing if we had time and what they've learned in Australia about writing. So I'm going to put John on the spot and see if he can share with us some of the things about writing.
Well, it's actually for New Zealand. What I'm interested in at the moment is looking around at studies that are looking at the effects of going into COVID kind of teaching. And in this part of the world, we went into it at the beginning of the school year, so we had a whole 8 months, and most of that, certainly in parts of Australia and New Zealand, was spent at distance. The effects on reading, if anything, is slightly down. The effects on mathematics are slightly up. But the biggest negative has been in writing. I'm not talking about handwriting, I'm talking about writing. And one of the things that certainly cues to us is that we probably need to be a little aware that during this COVID teaching, it's still important that we get our students to write. It is so much, sometimes harder because they want to be asynchronous, they want to have engagement, but there is an importance of writing. So please be aware that that's been the biggest negative across all the subjects, is that skill on writing. So let's pay attention to making sure we teach that as well.
And I'll build on that just a bit. In terms of composing as an assessment process itself, what has been really useful is setting up things like interactive digital notebooks where you can put questions right in there for students to be able to respond to. And it's all collected in one place. It's a great way to be able to find that. Another act of composition is in answering those 3 questions that I had posed earlier. What am I learning today? Why am I learning this? How will I know that I have learned it? And students can answer that in a Google form or, as we noted, in video. But keep in mind that there's back of the scenes written composition that is often going on even in those videos. Very rarely do we see student videos of those 3 questions where they come to the camera and they haven't thought a bit about what it is that they're going to say until that moment. In fact, very often we can tell that students are actually reading off of some notes that they have made themselves. Keep in mind that the first act of composition is typically an oral one.
And Nancy, when I think about all that work and writing, when we first went into this and we did that first survey back like April, May of parents, we were asking parents, what's the hardest thing for you to teach? And the overwhelming answer was writing. And we expected it to be mathematics. But so, I want to emphasize, John's comments, your comments, when we interviewed and surveyed parents about what was going to be the hardest thing for them to support their children on, overwhelmingly it was writing.
Mm-hmm. We have a number of other questions that are in the Q&A as well that have to do with mindset, or John, as you like to talk about them, mind frames in particular. Mind frames for families, mind frames for students. So I wondered if you wanted to address any of those thoughts about mind frames for families.
Well, the underlying principle here is that as educators, as students, it's about how we think about our role and about our purposes and about our expectations, probably more critically than sometimes what we do. And certainly the notion of looking at the mind frames for the teachers, the mind frames for the school leaders, and that probably most critical one was that when you walk into a class, physically or on the web, the mind frame we want you to have as you walk in is my job here today is to understand my impact. Which means you're going to have to be explicit about what you mean by impact. It's also about understanding and getting across to the students this notion that your job is there to help them attain that sense of impact. All of them, not just some of them. And also that sense of how big is that impact that we want to have. But also looking at the mind frames for students, and we touched on that many parts today, about their role in the classroom is not to come to school, whichever the medium is, and to sit there and be talked to sit there and just be recipients. We want them to be active learners. We want them to take a sense and learn a sense of responsibility so they can self-evaluate and self-understand. We want them to get them to make those decisions about where to next, which involves us, invoking this notion of the teacher's gradual release of responsibility, but also with parents. And probably the most important thing with parents during COVID teaching is to get them to learn the language of learning. It's not just about getting it right. It's not surveillance so that they do the work. It's enjoying that struggle is the most positive word in this business. And keep reminding the parents, if the students don't know it, then they're in the right place, the classroom. And it's okay not to know. It's okay to fail, because that's the purpose of learning, is to how you deal with failure, how you learn from it. And for many parents, that is a hard thing to learn, even though they all went to school and they must remember what it was like for them. Right now, many of them start off thinking it's about getting right or wrong. So making sure that that mind frame is there, and sometimes we have to teach the students, teach the parents, such as using teach back and retell to the parents, and getting the parents to realize that the purpose of schooling is struggle and the enjoyment of learning. Failure is a learner's best friend, and that's part of the mind frame we want to get across to parents. That's how they think, how the teachers think, how the students think, how the school leaders think, and how the parents think about their role in learning is probably so critical, particularly at this time.
Great. Well, thank you again. And again, we so appreciate everyone's time joining us today. On the initial deck, if anyone had a chance, we had all of the presenters' Twitter accounts, so be sure to follow them on Twitter, and you can always reach out with questions there. Please have a wonderful and safe rest of your day and week, and we really appreciate it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Be well.
Thank you.